Hello and welcome back to the Münster podcast. I'm your host Charles, and today we'll be looking at the 5 misunderstandings, stereotypes, and tropes about history that I absolutely am sick of hearing and seeing. History is more accessible to people than ever before because of the information revolution. It is so easy to research about a particular historical event, the impact of it, or different historians and different historiographic views more than ever, because it is so readily available. You can do it on your computer, your phone, and you even have public libraries and free education in most countries as well. So it's become more accessible than ever. So people can find out about their own culture, what their parents, how they lived, their grandparents. They can find out about their own countries as well and their own religions so much easier than before when information was very limited. However, this has some downsides, and I'll discuss it in the video. But it has led to a number of misunderstandings, very common misunderstandings about history, and also some stereotypes about certain parts of history that I don't think people know are, well, to be quite frank, incorrect really. So in the end, this is my opinion, but here are 5. I'll list 5 of my least favorite of these kind of misunderstandings and tropes. I'm not really sure what to call them really, because history is such a in-depth and large discipline. It's a seemingly endless discipline really. Because it's so large, it leaves tons of gaps of knowledge. I don't think there will ever be a single person who knows everything about history, to be honest, because it is such a vast subject. It can branch off into so many different areas, and it requires a lot of patience and it requires a lot of dedication to seriously understand every aspect of it. I know I certainly don't, and I'm sure that in the future, when I know a lot more, I'll probably look back on this video and actually disagree with some of the things that I am saying, because nothing is perfect in history. Historians can make plenty of mistakes, and no doubt they have made these mistakes. The main reason I also wanted to make this video was because, like I said earlier, history is more accessible than ever, and these sort of stereotypes and misunderstandings are becoming more and more common, especially when talking about modern politics. A lot of people like to apply events in the past to events that are happening in the present, which is one of the great things about history. However, this has led to many people misunderstanding history, not saying facts that really aren't true, and bending the truth a bit, leaving out context. So here are some of my things that I hate the most about how history is used nowadays. So we'll start off. Number 5, the West has been the leading civilization in history. Now this is one of my least favourite, hence why it has made the list, but it shows a serious lack of knowledge about history as a whole. It really shows that you only know a lot about European history, and even so, that is not necessarily a good knowledge of European history. So why does this stereotype exist? It mainly exists for 2 reasons. It likely exists because in the last 500 years or so, the West has been on the rise and still is one of the most dominant sort of civilizations in the last 500 years, and we are sort of living in that era right now. The second answer would also just be the fact that I think most people that I hear his opinion from are from the West, so naturally they're more interested in Western history, and it leads to this idea that the West has been the most powerful and the most dominant sort of area in history, which is definitely not the case. If you look at the era of Western domination over the world, it is so short compared to the rest of history, in which other areas of the world have been very successful, if not more successful. China and the Middle East, for example, have been very prosperous areas of the world throughout history. In fact, the Middle East has probably been the nicest place to live in history for most of history, really, to be honest. And it only has this stereotype that the rest of the world is this very desolate wasteland, and it's not a very nice place to live because of how nice the West is now. If you compare medieval Europe to medieval Muslim countries in the Middle East and North Africa, you will see a huge divide in technological and philosophical and cultural development. Muslim countries during the medieval age were some of the most advanced nations in the world. It was only until the Renaissance that gap really widened. But even then, during the Renaissance, these Muslim countries were still very, very advanced. It's only when they sort of ditched the sort of rationalist thoughts in favor of a more religious thought that they turned into a decline. And when the West became less and less religion, that is when they kind of overtook the other countries, especially when you compare them to something like China, in which China stayed very religious, and that is ultimately what led them to be left behind. So there's this misconception that the West has been the most powerful country, the most powerful collection of countries in history, when it really hasn't been. This is only a brief period. In fact, if we apply the past to the modern day, we can see that position can be usurped. For example, the rise of China and other smaller countries like Brazil and South Africa and India as well has shown that this balance of power isn't necessarily to last forever. There also seems to be this misconception when it comes to modern social justice politics that the white man has been the most dominant force throughout history, when, as reasons I stated before, it really hasn't been. In fact, if we are going to pin one particular ethnicity or race for being the most dominant force in history, it is probably the Middle Easterns and Arabs. That's not to demonize them. In fact, it's to sort of praise their civilizations for being so advanced and developed. However, even then, you can't even pinpoint exactly which ethnicity, nationality, or race has been the most dominant force throughout history, because people migrate, empires rise and they collapse, and there are geographic catastrophes that move people all across the world. So to have this notion that the West, or more specifically white people, have been the most dominant force throughout history is just so incredibly misinformed and almost insulting to other civilizations who have been just as successful. It's just a ridiculous view. There also seems to be a lack of attention given to Native American civilizations and Pacific civilizations too. There seems to be this stereotype that Native Americans were mostly nomads who didn't have any sort of developed societies, which really is not the case. Many Native Americans had highly urbanized and highly developed societies that actually, at some points, were a lot nicer and better places to live than the West. Some Native American societies were also based off of agricultural economies and had many irrigation-based societies that were highly advanced, highly urbanized, and reflected what was going on in Europe and the rest of the world. The Pacific too also had some developed civilizations which had huge monoliths erected during eras in which Europeans were still messing around and fighting European religious wars that ended with nothing but bloodshed. Number 4 is historical figures measured by modern standards. Now, I think I did touch on this in an episode in season 1 where we did talk about Winston Churchill and that whole sort of debacle. Historical figures measured by modern standards is possibly one of the worst things that you could do, because then pretty much everybody is evil. I will touch on this in another point in this video, but the modern views that we have now are so vastly different and contrast with what we have in the past that it's just you would be foolish to compare people from the past to the present. I think nowadays there is a general consensus that cheating on your partner or having sex with somebody else's partner is very immoral. However, in the past it was a lot more socially acceptable to do that. So do we look at figures like Martin Luther King, for example, and do we look down upon them for what they did? I think any rational person would probably say no, but for whatever reason, this sort of logical rule does not seem to apply to certain figures. For example, President Grant or Prime Minister Winston Churchill, in which every single historical figure has to be measured on a spectrum that they are good or that they are evil. I'm not exactly sure where this has come from, but my sort of theory, there are two theories behind this. One is because people are becoming less and less rational, and they are needing answers for a world that is becoming a lot very unfamiliar to them, and things are happening, things are going crazy in their eyes, and they need an answer. And labeling people as good and evil is something that religious people have done for a very long time, and it's a very good way to get answers to questions that you may not have been able to answer, potentially. My second theory, and this is kind of a joke, but I genuinely think this actually has some plausibility, is because of the overabundance and oversaturation in modern media of good versus evil stories. Now, what I mean by this is really large capitalist corporate media franchises like J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series and Lucasfilm's Star Wars series, things like that, are oversaturating, what is meant to be art, really, because they are novels and movies, and they are pieces of art. So these large corporate entities are oversaturating these markets, and they are producing stories where characters are good and evil. There is nothing in between them. The character is either good, or the character is either evil. That is where they draw the moral lines. So a lot of these people, when they're young, they read these books, and they actually continue to enjoy these pieces of media well into their adulthood, even though these are, franchises for children. The reason they do have a good versus evil kind of plot line and trajectory of morality really is because they are for children, because so they are simple to understand. You have a hero and a villain. However, these people continue to hold these views way into their adulthood because they don't grow out of reading Harry Potter, or they don't grow out of being obsessed with Marvel superheroes and things like that. So you end up with a generation who are influenced by these large corporate media franchises, and this affects their own views and perceptions on life. People can be good and evil. Maybe perhaps there are some concessions here. People can't be 100% good and 100% evil, but if you believe in good and evil, you believe that there is some sort of spectrum, and at some point in the middle, somebody is good and somebody's evil. Somebody's more good than they are evil at some point. Or there is a kind of cut-off point where good is no longer good and it's now evil. And it is these views that sort of warp perceptions of the past. Is Winston Churchill good or evil? That is such a stupid question, and that is basically an impossible question to ask. I mean, who are you asking this to? Are you asking this to a white English person? Are you asking this to a Bengali person who's starving to death? Is he good or evil? Is the death of 3 million Bengalis worth saving all of Europe? These questions are, difficult to answer if you believe in a good versus evil kind of characterization of, not just historical figures, but people in general. So, I mean, let's think of another example. What about Joseph Stalin? Is he good or evil? Most people would immediately say, yeah, he is like evil. But he also did some good things for Russia. He, defeated Adolf Hitler. He was instrumental to defeating Adolf Hitler. By the way, this isn't just he defeated Adolf Hitler. No, he was instrumental to Adolf Hitler. The emphasis that we put on the United States or Winston Churchill and beating the Nazis should also be put on Joseph Stalin too. Very important. Also industrialized a lot of part of Russia and made them into the country that they are now, pretty much. Is he evil for doing that? I don't know. Are the means evil? I mean, this turns into a bit of a philosophical debate, but I mainly am hating on the good versus evil sort of divide, because it makes no sense to me. It's a poor assessment of people, and it just doesn't really work when you actually want a nuanced argument about people. Again, is Winston Churchill evil? It's just not it. Another thing that is sort of linked to this is that Adolf Hitler is the most evil person in history, and everything that is bad gets compared to the Nazis, which is this isn't necessarily as big as a dig as what I was saying earlier, but it's just boring because it's unimaginative, and it shows that you really know nothing about history, because there are so many other people that, for lack of a better word, have a higher kill count than Hitler and have conquered a lot more than Hitler. I think it would be really interesting to see CNN and blue-haired girls on Twitter compare Donald Trump to Genghis Khan or Tamerlane for once. I think that would be really interesting. And also be interesting to see people stop comparing Joe Biden to Joseph Stalin or Vladimir Lenin, and instead compare them to someone like Pol Pot, because I think that would be far more interesting, and it also show that you know a lot more about history. Number 3, modern political views and social views are special and unique and are way more moral than what was in the past. This is a trope that sort of links into the one before, and I really hate it. There seems to be this view that people in the past were really immoral and they oversaw a lot of really obvious things that we would never do nowadays. For example, something as simple as feeding the poor or redistributing wealth or just not being racist, for example. These are just a few things that we often look at in history lessons, and we sneer down upon our ancestors for not seeing the obvious problems in society. However, the problems that I just mentioned, for example, wealth inequality or racism, well, two things. Firstly, they're issues that still exist in our modern society. And second of all, these are issues that have only just been issues for the last 70 years or so in human history. 70 to 100 years or so in human history. And this is a concept called social justice. Now, social justice is often used as like a pejorative nowadays, but if we're going to look at social justice literally, basically it's about helping people, closing the gap of inequality and things like that. But this is only a concept that has been, it's a relatively new compared to the rest of history. So when people look back at feudal kingdoms and serfdoms, and they often sneer at these kings and lords for not helping the poor people because there are clear benefits to closing their economic gap, and also it seems to be the morally correct thing to do to end racism in this particular institution. It doesn't really make sense because these, like said in the previous point, these are our modern views and they're not necessarily special either. And this mainly applies to modern religious views or modern views about social justice too. If you look throughout history, religion often comes in waves where people really have no hope and they need some sort of rationale to not only motivate themselves to survive and develop their civilization, but also to help give them some sort of hope and explanation for the things that are happening around them that they really cannot comprehend. This has happened throughout all of history and is also happening right now. People are turning to almost irrational arguments to explain to them why the world is so crazy and is so volatile right now. We can see this throughout history. For example, during the French Revolution, people turned to violent and ecstatic means to explain their poverty and their suffering, which involved the deaths of many, many people and a continental war. Religion tends to come and go inside our, human societies, and that definitely applies to the present day. For example, the strange things happening in this world has led to a rise in conservatism and a lot of religious people. However, modern religion is not so unique either. Islam and Christianity, the two main religions of the world, are actually quite young compared to the rest of history, and there have been areas of history where people have been very atheist and have also lived very prosperous lives. For example, during the Industrial Revolution, one of the most productive eras of human history in terms of technology and cultural development was mainly devoid of influence from religious institutions. Another great example of this is during the Islamic Enlightenment or the Islamic Renaissance, where the religious institutions had little influence over nations and little influence over people and how the country was run, thus leading to a huge technological and cultural advancement which saw the Islamic world eclipse the rest of the world for a very long time. Fast forward to the present day, people are turning to more simple explanations and simple, irrational views to explain the current situation. This is actually polarizing more people and is actually turning more people away from the central political spectrum, as people are wanting more radical and sometimes more, plosive answers to what is a failing system that has been ran by centrists for a very long time, which can explain the rise in, neo-fascism, right-wing populism, but also anarchism, communism, and the new woke left as well. Number 2. Slavery was practiced only by the West. This kind of links into a point that I made earlier in this video, that the West was the leading civilization in history. Slavery was definitely not practiced only by the West, and this is a really stupid trope that I think most people actually believe in, because slavery is something that is often attributed only to white people, because most people only study American history, and as a result, they only see the effects of the Atlantic slave trade. Slavery is a concept that has existed and still exists throughout history, and since basically the dawn of man, and since people began setting up farming and agricultural communities. In an age where there were no robots to assemble all your products, and there were no tractors to farm all the corn and wheat you could ever have wanted, muscle was the only way to develop a society, and there was no easier way to do that than through slavery. Actually think, how do you think ancient civilizations came to be without slavery? It is not something that was exclusively practiced by the white man, but the Atlantic slave trade stays forever in our mind because it is the largest instance of slavery that we've had in a very long time. In addition, it's the one that was the most rigorous and, unfortunately, one of the most efficient, but also had one of the most largest impacting legacies on the Western world. We have to also consider that because the United States is more or less the world hegemon and has been for the last 70 or so years, we mostly see world history through an American historiographic view, and as a result, things like the Atlantic slave trade get sort of inflated in their importance, as is a lot of American history. If, for whatever reason, the Soviet Union had become the world hegemon after the Cold War and then continued as world hegemon as Russia, we would see an increase in influence from Russia in terms of Russian culture and Russian history, and perhaps there's something like the Atlantic slave trade wouldn't be as important to us as it is right now. This is really important when considering how important historical events are and how exclusive historical events are to certain people, races, cultures, and ethnicities. We have to consider which country in the world right now is the dominant force and dominant spreader of culture as well. A lot of people around the world listen to American music, play American sports, are obsessed with American celebrities, and the reason for this is because America, not only geographically and economically, is absolutely gigantic, but they're also culturally the most dominant force in the world right now. Number 1. This is my least favourite trope. People in the past were stupid. This is a trope that I don't think people say all the time, but I think it is definitely implied when studying a lot of different aspects of history. People seem to assume that people in the past were really dumb, and the things they did can only be explained by the fact that their brains were just really tiny. An example is something like trepanning, in which people were in the Neolithic age would carve holes in people's heads to relieve some sort of pain. In fact, we don't actually know why they did that, but we just assumed that it was to release spirits in the head to basically relieve headaches. Because of things like this, and because Neolithic skulls with holes in them make up about 10% of all Neolithic skulls found, we just assume that people in the past are just cavemen and they're just stupid. And we end up creating this Monty Python-like stereotype that people in the past are really, really dumb. This carries over into the medieval ages too, in which people would use religion to justify burning women to death or going on crusades and fighting bloodthirsty wars. And this continues into the 17th century, in which we saw a large population of Germany completely wiped out in the name of God. We often look back on these times and think people are really dumb, but this stereotype is not necessarily true. If we start with something like really archaic and old medicine, we have to remember that placebo medicine actually does work, and it's something they still use in science today. The trepan skull that I talk about, a lot of them saw healing, which means that people did survive and they did live long enough after the really dangerous procedure that was trepanning. Other stuff like medieval medicine was mostly for placebo, but it did work, and if you think logically, if a community and society believes that cooking raw chicken meat would get rid of the demons that would make them ill, then you know that they have the wrong explanation, but they are surviving, and then you realize that this is a society and civilization that does not have the knowledge or technology to actually understand the world around them, but is finding ways to survive nevertheless, because that is what humans do, they just survive somehow. We also have this sort of stereotype that people in the past were not only really stupid, but also incredibly immoral. And we have this kind of villainous characterization of feudal lords and warlords and steppe nomads that would just go around mercilessly pillaging and killing all sorts of people. However, this idea that people in the past were incredibly immoral is not necessarily the case, and there is some logic behind some of the actions they did. As I previously mentioned, practices like slavery were actually really important to developing society, and in some cases was the only way to fully mobilize a workforce and get the maximum amount of potential out of a certain amount of land, and also develop some of the most urbanized and developed societies ever. In an era where there were no industrial means of creating lots and lots of goods and farming lots of land, slavery seemed to be the most logical step, and I'm sure if you lived in the past, you would either be a slave and not have to think for yourself, or you would just own some slaves, because that seems to be the most easy way to get money and also feed a population. We also look back on ancient warfare and sort of have this idea that warriors from the past are savages and barbarians that do nothing productive but wish to take trophies such as severed limbs and also heads. So we have this notion that they're all savages and potentially evil people in the past, but if you look at modern history, for example the Imperial Japanese Army, then you begin to realise that German barbarians from the ancient past are just as savage as the Japanese soldiers from the 1900s, and they both enjoyed taking trophies as the other. I'm not sure where this notion came from, but I have a feeling that this is sort of a reaction to being compared to our medieval ancestors, and the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Romantic era all being rejections of this highly religious medieval past. And as a result, it has been forever ingrained in our modern and early modern views that the medieval era was something terrible and an age of savagery. And as such, we should reject it and not aim to go back to what was a allegedly terrible time to live, full of immoral, evil, and stupid leaders. That was the Münster podcast. Those are my 5 things about history that I really dislike. If you disagree with any of these, please let me know down in the comments, because I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say. Everything I say here is just an opinion. As is with historical discussion, nothing is fact, so if you disagree with something, please let me know and why. That has been the Münster podcast. I have been your host, Charles, and thank you for listening.